What follows is yours for free, but do have a look at all the other things we do on patreon.com/wordinyour ear. And now, on with the show. Well, welcome to another Word in Your Ear, and let the record reflect that Paul Weller has been writing songs now for, my God, doesn't it make you feel old, for 50 years. It's unbelievable. And he's just published 100 of his lyrics in this fantastic, gorgeous, and picture-packed publication, Paul Weller, Magic, a Journal of Song. And he's been interviewed about each one and talked about the songwriting process and what he remembers about writing it by long-time admirer, an old pal of the podcast, Dylan Jones. Dylan, it's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. So look, firstly, you make it very clear early on that you were a major follower. You go back a long way with Weller. You saw him how many times? How many times did you see the Jam? Was it 8? I can't remember.
I think it was slightly more than that. It was I used to do the pub rock circuit and the Nag's Head and the Red Cow and places like that. And the Jam were one of the first punk groups to basically get on the circuit. So not only did I see them a hell of a lot, but I also saw a terrible group called the New Hearts, who eventually turned into Secret Affair, who seemed to support the Jam everywhere. Ian Page.
Yes, of course.
I remember him very well. So you were a teenager, weren't you? Why did you connect so strongly with the Jam?
I don't know. I suppose I was at that age, 16, 17. And it was an incredibly exciting period of my life and many other people's life. But they also worked fantastically well in small venues, like a lot of those groups did at the time. Yeah. I was less keen on them when they got bigger and started playing places like Hammersmith Odeon and Wembley Arena and places like that, because it became too sort of commodified, too gang orientated. But in those small venues, they were amazing.
So how do you come to write a book like this? I mean, does this start with the publisher or with Paul Weller or what? I mean, because it's slightly unusual, isn't it? Because it's a book of lyrics. How does that work?
You're probably sick of hearing this, but it's one of those projects that started in lockdown.
All right.
And I had a call from Paul's management one day and said, would you have any interest in doing some podcasts? Which obviously, because that would be enormous fun, and B, it would get me out of the house. So, and we did these podcasts, and I found them enjoyable, and I think Paul found them enjoyable enough to do some more of them. And then a few months later, I was down at his studio in near Woking, and the idea of this book was suggested, and he had done a couple of picture books with this publisher before. But he was interested in doing a book about his songwriting, principally his lyric writing, and wanted someone to ask him questions, listen to him, and formulate it. And that's how the idea started. So it was very simple, really.
So did you help him choose the songs? Because I think it's just over 100, isn't it? Was that selection part of yours? Did you suggest things?
No one suggests things to Paul.
Do they not?
That's interesting.
Surely.
No, okay.
We in all seriousness, I did, because I said I think that your inclination would be to veer towards the esoteric and things which were probably more contemporary. But I said, if you're going to do something like this, you're only going to do it once. It's probably the closest you're ever going to get to doing an autobiography. So you need to talk, as well as those things, about the big songs, about those songs that meant an awful lot of people who bought records by the Jam and the Style Council, and indeed who were there in the early part of his solo career. So I think it was very important that he addressed not just those songs, but also his frame of mind and what he was thinking when he was making those records.
Do you know, Dylan, I can I've heard you say that. I can just imagine you saying that. I really can.
Yeah.
I can imagine everybody at the publisher and Paul Weller's manager just going, Dylan, just go in there and tell him, please.
Yeah. You tell him.
In the nicest possible way. In a slightly flattering way, in the nicest possible way, what he should do. And you did it absolutely perfectly.
That is perfect.
That's really good.
So do you think, there's a bit early on where you talk about having the longevity and the variety approaching now, you know, a McCartney or a Bowie or Van Morrison, do you feel that he's, I'm guessing, not got the appreciation that he deserves as a songwriter?
Well, that is not for me to say, but one thing I think is very important and is something, is one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this project, is that if you listen to, or if you subscribe to Neil Tennant's idea that anyone in the entertainment industry, songwriter, musician, performer, what have you, particularly those that make records, probably has, I think he calls it the Imperial Phase or the Imperial period, where you make the best. In fact, I've heard you two talk about it in the past.
Neil invented that expression, actually.
There is a 7 or 8 year period where you make your best work. And if you compare something that so-and-so records now, it's not going to be as good as the material that he produced in the late 70s, early 70s, or whenever that imperial or purple period was. But I maintain, and I think there are quite a number of people who subscribe to this, that I think that in the last 5 or 6 years, Paul has made records that are easily as good as anything that he has recorded in his past, and some might say better. And I wanted to acknowledge that because I think it's true. And so that's why in the book, we talk about the Jam, the Style Council, the solo years, and what I call it the purple patch, or it's those last 5 or 6 records which are very, very important in the narrative arc of what he's done, as you said, since the mid-70s.
Do you think also that there, what goes along with that is people's relationship with kind of their favorite rock names? So they generally have a relationship that starts when they're 17 or whatever, and then it fades a bit in your 30s or whatever, 40s, but then it comes back late in life, doesn't it? When you look around, you think they're still there. I'm still here. You know what I mean? And the bond becomes a lot stronger, doesn't it? Later in life, do you think? I mean, that seems to happen with, I don't know, Van Morrison or Bob Dylan or Paul McCartney, all kinds of people.
I think not only is that true, completely true, precisely true, but I think that it's also something that the more self-aware rock star musician also appreciates, and consequently they start making records in an attempt to capture the excitement that perhaps the consumer had in their sort of first flush of fandom. However, it usually doesn't work. And I think that where Paul has been smart is not smart, but I think that he's been lucky in some respects, is that he hasn't. There is no inclination to make records like he used to. And these are new records containing material that he perhaps wouldn't have recorded 50 years ago. I do think another thing that's interesting is that I think for a lot of groups who were came up in that first flush of punk, and also with Weller himself, I think there was a reluctance to acknowledge the importance of melody. In fact, on the odd occasion when Paul wrote a ballad back in the day, there was an air of embarrassment about it because they were sort of too tender.
You're talking about English Rose, aren't you?
Exactly.
English Rose is this incredibly sentimental song, and I think you say in the notes that he didn't even want it on the album. He wanted it as a secret track or something, and he wouldn't have anybody in the studio when he was recording it. So he was embarrassed about. There was an old-fashioned masculinity that was kind of
exactly. Well, I think it was also framed by the sort of ethos of the time, which was youth, aggression, and almost sort of, a refusal to acknowledge any sort of emotion below the surface. And I think that's changed now. And I think that you can listen to those half a dozen records that he's made recently and be blown away by the use of melody, using melody in a way that McCartney had throughout his career.
Well, he started off, you were writing songs and being influenced by the Zombies, I think, and the Beatles and the Kinks, but he wasn't taking on board any of the stuff he was listening to at the time, which was Slade and Bowie and everything. He was going back to those early songs. Why was that? Why was he not using any of that contemporary music in the songs he was writing?
Well, if you talk to Paul, it's because his initiation into the world of music and pop culture, particularly British pop culture, was around the late 60s. I think he was quite an early adopter because he was such a huge fan of the Beatles. And he became incredibly interested, some might say obsessed, with the whole mod ethic and not only the type of music that was associated with mod culture, but also with ideas of presentation in graphics and in clothes and in record design, and the way that pop products were mediated to the public. Yeah. And that interest in mod culture has obviously stayed with him throughout his career.
Where do you stand on the Style Council phase?
Because you rather give the impression that they weren't taken very seriously, because a lot of people just really missed the jam and they thought it was a bit spivvy and superficial or whatever. I mean, it's the songs were just as political, weren't they? Walls Come Tumbling Down, etc.
I love that. I've never heard the word spivvy used.
Spivvy. I'm talking about blazers and espadrilles here.
I thought he was going to say feet, and then spivvy. We're suddenly we're in the world of Dad's Army. There
we are. Yeah.
I've heard the word feet, and I have heard that the word blazer used as an aggressive tool in the way that the Mark just used it, but never spiv. In all seriousness, the answer to your question, I actually think the Style Council, I'm not trying to be arch or perverse, but I think Style Council were a much better group than the Jam, I think, because...
Really?
Because he had made the decision to be sort of willfully transgressive and to not subscribe to the orthodoxies of what his previous group had done. I think that that determination to be varied and to use lots of different styles, which lots of critics found phony and ersatz, I think contributed to, at least for the first 4 or 5 years, to a really interesting body of work.
Right. Were you at all involved with I mean, this is, you say you'd done some picture books with this publisher beforehand. Yeah. Were you involved in the look of this at all? I mean, because that's clearly something you've got a lot of views on.
Initially, I mean, I think that I said at the outset, I said, if you're going to do this, you've got to make people understand what it is, that it isn't just a collection of photographs and some sort of casual reminiscences, because actually this was being done at the same time as McCartney was doing his very similar.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I hope that the book does justice to the reason that he wanted to do it in the first place. I mean, there were some disappointments. I mean, one of my favorite Weller songs is a song called Bulrush, which came, I think it was on the first album. It was very early in his solo career in the early 90s. And I was quite intrigued by this. And we were doing an interview one day, I think it's on film actually, at the studio in Woking, and I asked him about this song, and he looked at his shoes and looked up and said, "Just a song about bulrushes. I'm sorry, that's it."
That's your lot.
That's it. So you said at one point that you thought he was embarrassed that having a big vocabulary was somehow implying a betrayal of his class.
Yeah.
Is that right? I mean, we both interviewed him, Dave and I. We thought he was very eloquent, and he was always talking about the books he'd read. He was very kind of lots of literary influences and stuff. But do you think he was just self-conscious about being, over self-educated or what?
I think in the early days, yes, I do actually.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. He's incredibly eloquent. And when pressed and in the right mood, we'll talk about lots of those things. But I do think in the early days, there was a reluctance to acknowledge that. Also, I think that he wanted the music and the records to almost exist in a vacuum. I don't think he liked the contextualization, didn't like the explanations. And I think that, I interviewed him a lot back in the very late 70s and early 80s. And he could be very unforthcoming. In fact, I did say to him at one point, you were a difficult bugger to talk to back in the day.
Yeah. No,
he wasn't remotely apologetic, which I found quite engaging, actually.
But also, when you interviewed him back in the day, I interviewed him a couple of times back in the day, because it was with the group.
Yes,
with the jam, which is always inhibiting. You never get the truth from anybody when you interview them with the band, because they're all desperately trying to position themselves
and maintaining the group
strategy. The other two, aren't they?
Yeah.
Maintain group strategy, and they don't know what it is really. They only work it out while doing the interview. You're there to be part of the experiment. Really, it's when you write it later that they go, "Oh yes, that's what we are," and then they start performing it. I believe that's true.
It is true.
And it's interesting. Sorry to cut across you. Paul Weller wanted to kind of not have his personality be part of it, and yet that is his biggest thing. He is just as much a hero to a load of people now as he was back then. Yeah, more than anybody else of his generation. Far more than Johnny Rotten or the late Joe Strummer or whatever. Paul Weller is a hero to a load of people who took him on as their hero when they were 14 years old. And they still feel like that now.
I think that's true. And that's certainly, whenever I put anything on social media, the tsunami of stuff, of responses that comes back is immediate and vocal. And yes, uniformly sort of in that vein of hero worship, which is amazing, but also I think also causes its problems. And I think that a well documented part of his career is the fact that whenever he has, by accident or design, hit a scale of fame which he feels uncomfortable with, he immediately recoils because he finds it to be quite an intrusive aspect to the job.
I'm sure it is.
Looking at some of the lyrics on the page, you really get an idea just how adventurous they were, actually. It really struck me that That's Entertainment was a really good example. The entire song written without a single rhyme in it, I think. First rhyme, I think it's siren, concrete, howling and blinking or whatever, And it's I suppose it was all done in a mad, impetuous rush, it's kind of sense impressions. But I thought that was pretty interesting. Where would he have... who else would have influenced him that he might have come up with an idea like that?
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think that one of the original ideas for the book, which was junked after a while, was to include some of Paul's poetry, because he's a keen study of poets and poetry and the ways in which they work. I think you can also tell that if you look at Sound Effects, which I think is probably the best jam record, and it was a deliberately constructed record, not just in terms of its music, which was more sort of pushing towards the Gang of Four type world, but also in the construction of the lyrics, which are incredibly modernist. And you can tell that he'd taken particular instruction from some of the Liverpool poets.
Yes, Adrian Henry.
And a lot of the way that he had formulated his lyrics. So I agree with you. I think a lot of the way that he writes is in some respects incredibly complex, even when it's very simplistic.
There are all sorts of little tiny details I found really fascinating. There's one, and he's clearly part of a of a songwriter, English suburban songwriting tradition, that starts with the Kinks and the Squeeze and eventually the Streets and the Pulp and the Arctic Monkeys. But he's obsessed with this idea of being in the suburbs, being working and wanting to be in London. And he comes up to London when he's a teenager, I think, and records traffic noise. Was that right?
Yeah.
And tell me about that. Why was he doing that? He'd come back with these tapes of just London traffic.
Well, I think it's and as you say, this type of emotion and frustration has affected and contributed to the careers of so many great pop stars. It's that thing of being slightly outside the city and being desperate for it, but also being tied not to the country, but to your home, in many respects, even though I'm not an entertainer, I felt the same thing. If you live on the borders, you live in somewhere like High Wycombe, you're nearly there, but you're not there.
Yeah.
And so going up to town is incredibly intoxicating. And he took it to this ridiculous extreme of actually going to Oxford Circus, no less, and recording the traffic on a little cassette. Amazing.
It's extraordinary.
There must be traffic in Woking, surely.
Get your own traffic.
Kind of traffic, David.
Different kind of traffic. Let's talk about this whole business of kind of being in between one thing or another. That that his father was a self-employed builder. Regarded as what, lower middle class or whatever background. But a lot of people in previous generations of entertainers came from that kind of background. And they kind of presented themselves as slightly posher than they were. Whereas Paul Weller didn't. He went the other way, if anything. I always got a feeling when I met him that he always wanted to be regarded as being a little bit rougher than he actually was.
I couldn't comment on that, but I think that certainly your observation is right in that I think that became a trope for me. I mean, Bruce Springsteen did a very similar thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. He was from somewhere that New Jersey, which it's almost New York, but it's not New York.
Oh, it's certainly not New York.
Well,
it's Essex, basically, is what it is.
Enduring it too.
It's I think possibly there's that adoption of an urban environment is something which is very popular and has always been. But even if you take his contemporaries like The Clash, there was such a sort of the idea of The Clash being a group about London. That was as manufactured as anything else during the punk times, wasn't it? And I think John Savage said that the first Clash album is almost like a concept album about West London. And it's true.
Yeah.
I like the thing you were writing about his song titles, that he had this thing about slightly tabloid sounding song titles. Life at a Top People's Health Farm. I was a Dole Dad's Toy Boy. The Story of Someone's Shoe. I mean, those are great titles. So is he one of those people, a little like Morrissey, where once you've got the title and you've got people's attention, kind of a large amount of the heavy lifting is done?
I think when he was working strictly in the pop arena, that was certainly true. And I think you can look at a lot of the song titles during the period of the Jam and say the same thing. And I think particularly you look at sound effects and think that that's a very modernist tabloid piece of work.
Yeah.
But I think recently that has not been the case. And I think that he has allowed his craft and his sort of artistic inclinations to define what he's done. And I think he's a lot less prescriptive now than he used to be.
How many hits did they used to have to write at the height of the Jam? It must have had a rate of production pretty much like Ray Davies with the Kinks in the 60s, because they were at number one every couple of months, weren't they? Or am I misremembering that?
I think you're right. I think there was it was aping that sort of the manufacturing cycle of the mid-60s, wasn't it? When you'd have 4 singles a year and one album, maybe 2 albums.
Yeah.
Although in the 60s, you might throw in the odd EP as well.
Yes, absolutely.
I never realised their career was hanging on a thread very early on. I think at one point at Polydor, I think you said that they're told they've got to cover a 10cc song. Was that right? Because what saved them from having to do that? They presumably had a hit with something else. I mean, that was the order.
They had a particularly underperforming second album, the Modern World album. Which was rushed and had some weak covers on it. Even had a Bruce Foxton song on it. It wasn't very good.
Yeah.
And then he had done some preliminary recording for All Mod Cons. And a very astute record company executive basically said it's not good enough, and told him to go away and write some better material, which he did. And I think, and he acknowledges that was the kick up the backside that he needed to get to a level where he could compete at the level that he wanted to compete.
So you're talking about that later period, and you made the point that when he goes into his kind of solo career, that Steve Winwood becomes the kind of leitmotif, as you call it. So in what way? So Steve Winwood, did he consciously kind of use him as a kind of role model, and if so, in what way?
I think Paul would deny that, but I think he was certainly. If you listen to the first couple of solo singles and the first couple of albums, I think you can. The smell of traffic, a different kind of traffic, is very, very powerful. And I think there was a move towards perhaps making music that sounded a little more like Traffic and Stevie Winwood, and also an adoption of a wider kind of mentality. Because I think that even though the Style Council had been deliberately varied in its genre of music, and also in terms of its presentation, I think the mere idea of being a pop group he found stultifying after a while, and indeed the records that they made towards the end of their career were not terrific.
So you don't hold out any hopes for a Jam reunion?
Why would anybody want one? I mean, personally, I hate reunions. I see no point in them. But no, there will never be a jam reunion. And I think that.
Why are you so convinced of that?
I honestly don't think. I mean, Paul has probably been asked that question more than any other question he's been asked in his career, and I don't think he's going to snap.
Right.
No, understood. I must admit, I think it probably would be a mistake. I don't know.
It'd be awful. It would be awful. And even the people who are still rather desperately clamoring for it, I think, would be disappointed after about 7 minutes.
Yeah.
No, that's undoubtedly true, but it very often doesn't stop these things happening.
Wouldn't stop people going.
It's the size of the check tends to be the thing that decides it in the end.
Well, you can see, I think there is a certain amount of inevitability of Oasis or the Smiths reforming at some point, because eventually the check just gets too big. Live Nation just put. It's like that old Eddie Murphy thing when he made a terrible film and someone, a critic said, "Why did you make that terrible film?" I think it was called Best Defense, and he said, "Because 3 men came into a room carrying a check."
This is.
Absolutely. But I don't think the Jam will ever reform.
So, okay, but you think Oasis and the Smiths... Oh, I definitely Oasis, yes. But
bet my house on it. My house on it.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Well, Oasis only needs 2 people to agree, really. And they eventually will, the rest of it doesn't matter so much,
Yeah. So, Dylan, is this the end of your project started in lockdown? Or you finally ticked them all off? Are you now onto other things? What else are you doing?
I've left the house. I've officially left the house, yeah.
Right. What else are you doing? You must be a further 2 books along.
I started a small film company. We're making documentaries, and I'm writing a musical with Jimmy Webb.
Oh, my goodness, that's amazing.
Very good.
Wow.
Yeah. Are you going to tell us anything more about that?
Well, the musical is using Jimmy Webb's catalogue. We're also commissioning Jimmy to write 2 new songs, and the narrative arc of the show, the book, is broadly his his life, and we're just coming to the end of our first sort of writing session, in terms of we got the first version of the book is finished, the electronic deck is finished, and now we're going out to the industry to seek the unvarnished truth.
That's fantastic.
Well,
so what's your contribution towards that?
I have helped write the book. I am the co-writer of the book.
Dylan is the guy they've sent in to talk sense to Jimmy Webb.
That's really
just like he did the same. That's what he does.
Absolutely.
I will talk sense to pop stars. But
we should end by asking you your opinion of the greatest Paul Weller song that you think that he's written.
Actually, aspects.
Oh, I don't know if I know that.
Well, listen to the record. Listen to True Meanings, the record that came out about three or 4 years ago.
Which is the one you described as his masterpiece.
I honestly think it is, and it sounds very Toady-ish, but it's a fantastic.
Very John Martin, isn't it? Quite Nick Drake.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if I know that song specifically. Well, very good.
Cheer yourself up, Mark, and go and listen to it. It'll make your day, I promise.
There's your homework.
Absolutely.
I finally got to ask one question about the cover. I think it's very bold to put a picture of Steve Marriott on the cover.
You're the second person to say that. The first person was me.
But it's
we will not be the last. We will not be the last.
Yeah. Very good.
Absolutely uncanny resemblance.
It is. It's strange.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. Paul Weller, Magic, A Journal of Song. We'll put a little plug to where you can order it at the bottom of this podcast. Fantastic to talk to you. Thanks very much, Dylan.